everybody for being with us for the Comic-Con at Home panel on motherhood and reproductive choice in comics. My name is Hilary Chute, and I am the author most recently of the book Why Comics? From Underground to Everywhere. And I'm also a comics and graphic novels columnist for the New York Times Book Review. And I am very excited today to be moderating this fascinating panel, as I said, on motherhood and reproductive choice in comics. And I'm really happy to be able to welcome three cartoonists who are with us from three different countries today, which is exciting. So our first panelist is Lisa Wool-rim Sjoblom, and she's the creator of Palimpsest, Documents from a Korean Adoption. Lisa is an illustrator, cartoonist, and graphic designer living in Auckland, New Zealand, with her partner and two children. She has a master's degree in literature from Södertörn University and has studied art at the Comic Art School in Malmö. Lisa is an adoptee rights activist, and Palimpsest is her first graphic novel. And I would also like to say that it's really great that Palimpsest in this edition is translated from the Swedish, and that Lisa worked on the translation with two other translators. Our next panelist is Leslie Stein, who is the creator of I Know You Writer, a memoir, and Leslie is joining us today from Brooklyn, New York. She is the cartoonist behind the book Present, which won the LA Times Book Prize Award, as well as the cartoonist behind the titles Bright-Eyed at Midnight and The Eye of the Majestic Creature series. Her diary comics have been featured on The New Yorker, Vice, and in the Best American Comics Anthology. She lives, as you might have figured, in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm really excited to also have Teresa Wong here, and she is the creator of Dear Scarlet, a story of my postpartum depression. And she's joining us today from Calgary, Canada. She is, as you might expect, a Calgary-based writer who had 3 children in less than 5 years. And I'm reading the bio from Teresa's book, which I think is such a great bio. And I actually reviewed this book in the New York Times Book Review, and I quoted this first line from her bio. So I'll read it again. It's so good. She's a Calgary-based writer who had 3 children in less than 5 years. At first, she feared motherhood would destroy her, but is pleasantly surprised to find herself remade. When the kids are asleep, she writes and draws pictures. When she is asleep, it is never for long. Dear Scarlet is her first book. So I'm really thrilled to be talking to all of you. And I guess the first thing I'd like to ask everyone to do is just to describe your book in a few sentences. So, you know, this is a panel that's called Motherhood and Reproductive Choice in Comics. And it's about a kind of range of issues around motherhood, but there are different kinds of issues, right? So Lisa's book is about adoption. Leslie's book is about abortion, among other things. And Teresa's book is about postpartum depression. So we're coming at this topic from different angles and from different sets of stories. And I should say, of course, that all of your books are memoirs. So if you could just say a little bit about what your book is about for people who may not have encountered them before, that would be great. And Lisa, why don't we start with you, and then we'll hear from Leslie and then Teresa.
Yeah, so my book tells the story about when I started searching for my Korean parents. I'm adopted from Korea, and I had always wondered where I come from. And when I gave birth to my first child, all these questions started bubbling up again, and I decided to start searching. And what I wasn't prepared for then was that I would discover that there was a lot of corruption involved in my adoption. So my book is about the search and the very disturbing things that I found, but it's also a story about a person who is sort of changing her view on what adoption is, and going from being quite in the fog to becoming a full-blown activist fighting for adoptee justice.
Great, thank you. Leslie?
Okay, yeah, so my book's called I Know You Writer, and yeah, I guess the main thing it chronicles, the way I set up the story, is around an abortion I had when I was about 35. And like a lot of the conversations I was having with friends and family in my 30s were about, having children or not having children. And I wanted to use the abortion that I had at that time to structure a story where there were multiple conversations from different perspectives, talking about just people's philosophy about having children, and highlighting in a more conversational tone different takes on that and like different people's philosophies. So that's what that's about.
Great, thank you. Teresa?
Well, my book, as you can guess from the title, is the story of my postpartum depression, but I like to really frame it as just a book about new motherhood. This is the story of when I had my first baby, and I feel like a lot of people have told me now that they identified with it, whether they had depression or not, postpartum, and it's just that, I guess, overwhelming feeling of everything changing when you have a newborn, and you just don't feel like yourself, and you don't know how to make a new life out of what has happened. And so I think that's more of what it's about.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if each of you could explain how you started doing comics and how you came to these stories in the comics medium.
I'll go first. Well, I didn't actually plan to do it in comics because I've been trying to become a writer my whole life. I've always been interested in drawing, but I didn't think I was very good at it. And I knew from very early on that I wanted to do something about adoption. So it's always been, if I ever make one book, it's going to be about adoption. And I tried and tried and tried, but I never finished any manuscripts, and I felt like I didn't have enough to say. And then I took some drawing courses, and someone told me that they recommended me to try on comics, so I did. So at first I made sort of like fun comic strips about being adopted that you were supposed to laugh at.
Can I interrupt for a moment? So yes. What would be an example of what one of those strips looked like?
Yeah, like for instance that my parents, when they said that they were going to adopt, they said, but how are you going to communicate with the children? Because they were speaking in a foreign language, and they say, yeah, well, I mean, I don't know really. And they say, oh yeah, but if nothing works, you can always speak English with them, which is the idea that English is the sort of lingua franca for the whole world.
Right.
Yeah. Or that people asked if they had, if there was a return policy. And at first I thought that this was something one could laugh at, and then later I realized that these are extremely painful and disturbing questions. But then, yeah, I started working in the comics medium and realized that this is a really brilliant way to communicate something really dark and controversial as it is to criticize adoption, and to portray things like trafficking in children and abuse and all these hard topics that I deal with. So I took the project to the comic school that you mentioned that I went to, and just dove in and hoped for the best. So it wasn't really a plan on my path to do it in a comic format, but I tried it and felt really comfortable with it, and I think it turned out really well.
It's so interesting that you tried writing it and somehow it felt harder, and then when you turned to comics, somehow it felt easier. It's just a sort of
and one thing I really like about doing it visually, and I talk about this quite often, is the bit about representation, because I grew up in a very white community, and and I was never really taught about that, to see myself as an Asian. So it became sort of a course for myself to see myself, what I look like, and what my first people looked like. And instead of having to describe myself in terms of difference, which I would have to do in a text, in a white context, I could just draw myself and draw other Asians without having to say we look different and we have an almost retort to like racist stereotypes to describe oneself, because sometimes it's almost required of us for people to understand that we look Asian. You know, you have to describe yourself in a way you maybe not even look, like slanted eyes and yeah, things like that. So in that sense, I thought that the comics medium was absolutely brilliant, to just represent myself without having to make myself different, so to speak.
That's such an interesting response. Leslie, how did you come to comics? So this isn't your first book, unlike in Teresa and Lisa's case. Can you tell a little bit about how you became a cartoonist, and then how you decided on this topic for a collection of comics?
Of course. Well, I'll start. I just want to say something about something Lisa said, which is that I think comic medium, and all three of us, like our comic portrayal of ourselves is very friendly, but they're dealing with super difficult topics. And I think that's one of the strengths of it, because I think if I was writing in prose, like I don't think I would attack this story. Or if I did, I would attack it in a totally different way. But I thought, and especially for this topic, like I think I can do a good job in comics with this, and it can make a somewhat unapproachable topic much more digestible for people. So I totally relate to that. And then going backwards, I mean, I'm just, I feel like I started drawing comics as soon as I could. I was like 4 or 5, and I started doing autobiographical comics. I had a series when I was like 13 called Leslie in my little notebook. And, and I, and it was all
so
about being grunge and the 90s.
When's that coming out?
Yeah, bring that out. It sounds adorable.
I don't think I have them here. I think they're at my mom's house. I could show you some older work, but so I ended up actually going to school and doing comics at School of Visual Arts. I moved to New York when I was 19, and I just have been doing that ever since then. So this is my, I used to self-publish, and then this is my 6th book. I did, I guess, 4 with Fantagraphics, and then 2 with Drawn and Quarterly so far. But yeah, I've been working in this, the last 3 books were all in this watercolor style and all autobiographical, and I was doing them for Vice. And what was happening was that I was doing them weekly for Vice, and so I was just doing little vignettes about my life, and what started happening is the feedback I was getting was kind of giving me license to explore darker topics, because stuff that I was really afraid of putting out there, people are like, thank you for writing about that. You know? And so when this situation occurred, and I was looking for a way to frame, you know, some ideas I was having, it just seemed like, okay, perfect. Like I didn't intend for it to be a book. I was just going to do a short piece for a website. But then once I got rolling on it, I realized I had a lot more to say about it, and it ended up being longer than I anticipated. So.
Great, thank you. Teresa, what about you?
Well, it was interesting listening to Lisa talk, because a bit of her story mirrors mine. I am a writer, like a copywriter in my day job, and a wannabe writer outside of that. And I never thought I would do a comic or a graphic. When I was pregnant with my 3rd child, I had the idea of doing something about postpartum depression, because just a lot of those memories came flooding back, and I had a lot of therapy, and I had gone through, had medication and everything, and thought I was done with it, but obviously I wasn't. And so I felt like I had to write about it to kind of just get it out of me and onto paper. But at the same time, I was reading a lot of graphic narratives and really inspired by them, and really wishing I could do something like that as a book. And so I sat down and I wrote out a script. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll kind of storyboard this out in my sketchbook and just kind of plot it out so that I could show an illustrator friend of mine, and we could collaborate, and he could illustrate it, and I could write the story. And when I had that done and I showed him, he just kind of pushed the book back at me and said, no, I won't do this. Like, you have to do this, because the story is just so personal, and it would be better all coming from your hand. And so I did say to him, I'm like, are you sure? Because I can only draw like 20% better than what I've done here. and he's like, just go for it, try it. And so I took another stab, and I kind of did the best I could. I feel a little awkward today even being on this panel, because I feel like my skills aren't up there with everyone else's in terms of drawing practice, but it I guess no one ever said no, like, when when things got rolling, no one ever said that the drawings took away from the story, or and in a way, I guess some people have said that it adds to the story because it's a very vulnerable story. And so the lack of confidence in the drawings kind of echoes that. But yeah, I'm glad it's out there. And as in both Lisa and Leslie's stories, I think because it's such a heavy topic, and also there's a lot of silence around it, like the silence of being at home with a newborn, or the silence of having just to deal with your emotions, when you see these adoption agencies kind of sending you lies, or the silence around having an abortion. Like, all that silence is really well served by the visuals, like to have and I noticed that when I read all of our books, is that that kind of silence comes through in a way that you couldn't get in a prose text.
And I think your drawings, I'm glad you made that point about the vulnerability. I remember reading in an interview with you back when I was reviewing your book for the Times, that storyboarding that then became the actual book anecdote, right, which is such a good anecdote. There's something so expressive about the way you draw faces. I think it really works. And I think having it in your hand makes it really powerful in a way it wouldn't be otherwise in somebody else.
No, I'm really thankful to that friend who made me do
that.
Yeah.
Good advice. But you mentioned something interesting, which is reading other graphic narratives. And I'm wondering, and this is for everybody, so maybe we could circle back to Lisa and go down the line. If people had influences in terms of other cartoonists writing about motherhood and reproductive choice, issues around reproduction, or just cartoonists, period, not related to motherhood, but could people talk a little bit, if they have, comics influences, about some of those creators who have been important to you? Lisa, have any been important to you?
Yeah, I've been reading comics my whole life, so I have a number of cartoonists that I really, really love. But when I work myself, I try not to read anything, because I just get so crushed, because everyone is so extremely talented. And just like Teresa, I lack confidence when it comes to drawing. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I find drawing extremely hard, and I also find that we don't really talk about that, because we're always expected to be really, really great at drawing and knowing exactly what we're doing. And I have very little confidence in my own work. So when I'm actually working, I try not to read anyone, because I keep changing my style and keep changing that this is what a real cartoonist, does, and I'm not doing it, so I'm a fake. But I think that in terms of inspiration, of course, one of my big inspirations has been Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and not so much in terms of style, but in terms of what you can tell with comics. So I remember when I read him for the first time, because then up till then I only been reading like superheroes and children's comics and very light stories, and I realized that you can actually deal with really, really deep and difficult subjects in comics. And people also around me talked about comics as something that is just for children, or it's just for boys, or it's just superheroes. Yeah. And then the next big comic for me that came out, which had a similar impact, was Satrapi's Persepolis, which I thought was a wonderful combination of darkness and humor. Mm-hmm. So it was nice to see that element brought into it, that you also can tell a very a difficult story, but also bring in a lot of laughter to it. So I would say that those two, and of course, let's see if I pronounce the name right, Alison Bechdel, yeah. Especially the one, Are You My Mother? I think it's called.
Yep.
If I'm not wrong, yeah.
Yeah, speaking of motherhood, right? There's this book, Are You My Mother?
And I actually started reading that just when I started working on Palimpsest. So I just closed it immediately. Oh gosh, she's writing about similar things, so I'm not allowed to read it. So I read it after I made Palimpsest, and I absolutely loved it. So yeah, so those three are really important to me.
Great, thank you. I mean, it's interesting thinking about this panel earlier today before we started. Mouse is a book that has been really important to me too, and I worked on a book with Art Spiegelman about Mouse called Meta Mouse. So we worked on this book together. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it. Obviously, it's about the Holocaust, it's about death camps, but it's also really about filial relationships, about the absence of his mother and his really difficult relationship with both of his parents. I mean, it's really a parent-child book in so many ways. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Leslie, what about you in terms of cartoonist influences, if any?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think every book I do, there's like things get brought out of the past, because I don't read a lot of comics while I'm in the middle of a book either. Right. It just gets too confusing. But I see a lot of things coming out from my past, like a few years when all I did was read comics. So like for this book, one artist that comes to mind that I think I was drawing upon was a woman named Debbie Dreschler, who did a lot of stuff in the 90s. And then I also was thinking a little bit about Chester Brown and Paying for It, because he's highlighting a topic that not a lot of people talk about, but is something that a lot of people deal with. And whether or not you agree with his take on like love or sex or prostitution or whatever, it still makes you think about your own relationship to these things, like in different ways. So that's what I was trying to do in this book. I think those two, but then visually, I'm always like, especially with the watercolor style and the open lines, like I'm definitely feeling like Schultz and Doug Ryder, my visual influences right now.
Yes. So, I mean, your book, and Lisa, your book too, such beautiful color in both of your books. Leslie, will you talk a little bit about the unique way you draw faces? Because when I think about your work, I think of the visual shorthand of your faces. It's like the first thing. It's sort of, to me, like your signature. How did you start doing that?
So I kind of like lost my mind in the year 2014. I had been working on a series called I, the Majestic Creature for like 10 years. And it was like very, very dense, stippled, black and white work. And I kept looking at it and I'm like, man, you need to loosen up. Like, how do you do that? You just like, one day you're like, yeah, I'm loose now. So what I did is, I kept writing myself notes and just like putting them on my drawing table and just like loosen up, do this, do that. And then this one day, New Year's Eve, 2014, I started writing a diary comic every day. And because I wasn't thinking, I would just do like almost like an emoji face with my hair. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of, over the year I did that. That was a book called Bright Eyed at Midnight that came out like 2015, which was just like the best of that year of me drawing comics every day. That's how it came out. that style. Just by the end of the year, I'd figured that out. But really all it is it's like I draw a circle on the page in pencil, and then I figure out how I want to it's just 2 dots for eyes and a mouth, but I have her looking a certain way, and then I erase that. So it looks really open, even though her face is in essence contained to me knowing the backstory of the
Right.
image.
Interesting. Well, it works. I like that contained, not contained thing. And I'm glad to know the secret of the penciling.
Yeah.
behind the faces. Teresa, so you mentioned influences, which kicked us off. What books were you reading that were graphic that got you inspired?
I mean, like Lisa, Persepolis was a major influence in terms of that being the first graphic novel I read that was about stuff that I didn't think comics would tread on, you know, that kind of story, a memoir, and just all the feelings involved behind it. And then also Marjane Satrapi's style seemed so simple compared to other comics I had read and seen as a kid. And then there's a British cartoonist named Simone Leah, who I started reading. She has had a couple of books, one called Fluffy, which was a graphic novel, and then a graphic memoir called, I'm going to get this wrong, but Please God Help Me Find a Husband, or Find Me a Husband. And it was the story of her, I guess, searching for a husband, wondering if she was ever going to get married. And just the humor she brought to that, and then the simplicity of her drawings made me think, well, maybe I can do something like that. And then a little bit more in the motherhood bent, the work of Kyler Roberts. I had read her book Sunburning, and really loved that, and her humor, and just also her simple lines, but you know, they're deceptively simple, like they are really well studied. All kind of kept drawing me towards, you know, trying to make comics that told really interesting stories about women's lives and women's inner thoughts. And then also Lucy Knisley, and it was kind of funny because she hadn't written anything about motherhood up until then. And then the year that my book came out last year, she also came out with a book called Kid Gloves, that talks about her pregnancy and everything that came out of that. And so I feel like there is a kind of movement in graphics right now that I'm seeing more and more of more women creators, and people coming to it from, you know, maybe outside of the typical comics world, and bringing these kind of new and different stories to light.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking before this panel about comics, roughly, you know, on our subject of motherhood and reproductive choices. And, you know, I published a book called Graphic Women in 2010 that profiles 5 cartoonists. And I was thinking, you know, it's interesting. Of those 5 cartoonists, only 2 of them are mothers. And one of them is Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, who writes about motherhood and her sexual life, like sort of a piece in a really interesting way. Mm-hmm. And then 2 of the other cartoonists in the book are Linda Berry and Alison Bechtel. Mm-hmm. And I was once doing a live event with them, a public conversation, where the issue of motherhood came up, and they both mentioned that they weren't mothers and that they were happy to not be mothers. And there was clapping from the audience. So, you know, it's just sort of interesting to think, especially given the sort of like disparate range of topics that this panel addresses, just the idea of people addressing not only motherhood, but issues around whether to be a mother, or sort of like certain life choices that take you on certain paths or not. So
yeah, for sure.
I I think you're right that the field is really opening up now, and there's just more and more really interesting work here. I want to ask all of you a question about your own mothers, because your own mothers feature in all of your works. And reading all of your books, it struck me that your mothers are there as figures of both connection and disconnection at the same time. So sort of doing both of those things. And Teresa, I'll just hold this up. I really loved your piece in last month's Believer, which I, got in the mail and was happy to see you included in, which is this piece called "This Is Not a Feel-Good Movie," which is this kind of, I found sort of painful piece about you trying to watch the Joy Luck Club movie with your mother and her not being into it at all. And so I was wondering, obviously this is sort of explicitly, Lisa, a part of your book, but it's in all of your work. If you might sort of talk about that complicated relationship that you have as a child with your mother, singular, or mothers, plural, maybe Lisa, in your case.
Well, it's a bit, I mean, when I grew up, I only knew one mother, which was my adoptive mother. Yeah, it was, I wouldn't call it difficult, but I know now when I'm an adult that she struggled a bit because I was so into Korea when I was adopted, and for many years onwards that I really identified as Korean, and I was only talking about that and about my Korean parents, and I think that was a bit hard for her. And my Korean mother, she made herself known when I turned 15, because that's when she was forced to give me up. So I started thinking when I was 15 myself that what if I had a child now and had to give it up away. But this was, of course, long before I became a mother myself. So I sort of took for granted, because that's also what we learn as adoptees, that, it's perfectly normal to have a kid and leave it, especially if you're a person of color, to leave your child to travel around the globe for international adoption, to give the child a better life, because that is what we are taught. So I was very sympathetic about it, but I thought that it was just something that fixed her life. It was easy, and she was probably married and had other children, and everything was fine. And then when I had my first child and realized how incredibly difficult it was, I told Teresa just the other day that how much I identified with her book, and about how when I fell into my own postpartum depression, it really made me appreciate motherhood in a different way, and realizing that you can't take this for granted just because so many people in the world are giving birth every day and having children. It can be really, really challenging. So then I realized that because my Swedish mother, my adopted mother, had told me all the time that it was meant to be. I was meant to be her daughter, which I really, really loved hearing as a kid. But then when I had my own child and realized that, my mom was 15, that it can't really be meant to be that a 15-year-old is supposed to become pregnant and give up a child so that a woman in the West can have that child. Certainly it can't be, that can't be meant to be, because that is a horrible trauma. And just fast forwarding to when I meet my Korean mother, it was of course extremely complicated, because she is so marked by trauma and loss and grief. So it was very difficult for us to have a relationship, because of course I come from the same place. And I knew that her pain came from having me and having to give me up, and then everything that happened after that. So I think that motherhood for me is just such an incredibly complicated and even sometimes toxic topic to talk about,
right?
Because it's completely intertwined with trauma and loss, and how there is a whole industry just feeding on this vulnerability. Because in my case, or in my mother's case, she wasn't poor, for instance. She wasn't from an impoverished background, like so many other mothers who have to give up their children, and what we are fed in the idea about what adoption is. So she could have kept me if the circumstances had been different. So I think I lost my track a bit there, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you were describing what I was framing as connection and disconnection really, really well, and it sounds complicated.
I think, just to add one thing, I think that what makes it really complicated, though, is as an adoptee, you're always taught to be considerate about other people's feelings. So I think that I have felt from quite early on that I always had to be maternal to my mothers.
Right.
That I had to be understanding of my mother not being able to have a child, and my Korean mother to having to give up a child. And I had to tread very lightly around these subjects and not talk about my own pain for having been abandoned. So it feels like the positions are reversed a bit. I have to be the grown-up in the room all the time and take care of everybody else's feelings. And it's not just about upsetting my own mothers, it's also about not upsetting everyone else who have adopted in the world.
Got it.
Because being critical of adoption is extremely controversial still, and you get a lot of hatred for it. So if you address these topics, you are told that you are hurting everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Phew. Yeah. And I think your book addresses those topics and addresses their complexity really, really well and really beautifully. Leslie, what about you? It's interesting, the figure of your mom in this book, who seems like a person that you want to spend time with, but you're also sort of bracing for comments she might make about your status, that type of thing.
Well, I think that the reason I put those conversations in that book is that I viewed them as being somewhat universal for, a lot of people I know, a lot of women I know talk about how their moms are like, when are you gonna get married? When are you gonna have kids? And sometimes those can be difficult conversations to have or annoying, if you don't plan to, because you feel like you're withholding something from them. Something like Lisa was talking about parenting your parents, and I think I'm familiar with that, and that within this book, I don't use a narration, so you won't see me going like, this is how I felt today. So you have to you can put yourself onto the character. That's the point of doing that. But my avatar in it goes through her abortion procedure the day before Christmas, where she has to fly home and be with her mother. And if you notice in the book, she does not mention that this has happened. And that is and yet her mother is talking about, wanting a grandchild and all these things. And like, for me in that instance, I felt the same way. I was like, I want to protect you from my feelings in my life.
Right.
But you're not really giving, like, it's not equal. And I think that dynamic is actually pretty common and changes throughout time. So, I'm on one side of it only right now. So that's how I portray it. But also, sometimes those things that are universal and kind of annoying can be really funny. Like if you take a step back, someone's saying this and you're like, how ironic is that? You're like, my character's like, Jesus, not today. Just not today.
Right.
So.
Right. Makes sense. Of all days. Yeah.
Yeah.
Teresa, what about you?
I
brought up this topic.
Yeah, definitely relate to the kind of dark humor around mother-daughter interactions, like the comic you brought up when I tried to show my mom the Joy Luck Club and thought that this would bring us closer together, and she basically thought that it was a super boring movie. She didn't feel like finishing. And a lot of people have been like, oh, that must have been so heartbreaking, but honestly I kind of thought it was funny, like and not at all uncommon in our relationship, like as I was growing up and even now. My mom's an immigrant. She came to Canada when she was young and had me here, and so we've got a lot of barriers and disconnection just because of that, because I grew up basically Canadian, and And so there's a bit of a language barrier, like my Chinese isn't great. And then there's a cultural barrier. And then I think there are just those natural barriers between mothers and daughters that, you know, Leslie was getting at. And that where, you know, like you can't, you want so much. I know my mom wants so much for me, but you know, I can't be exactly the person that she wants me to be because I have to be myself. And I think I've gotten.
Did you say because that would be hell?
Oh no, because I would have to be myself.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
But also, yeah, I mean, also if I were a doctor or a lawyer or concert pianist, that would probably be hell.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, but I think one thing I wanted to add though was having become a mom myself, and you know, my daughter Scarlet is now 10. You know, I kind of am having that reckoning with myself too, is that, you know, I can't put these expectations on her because, you know, she has to be herself and grow up to be whoever she wants to be. And so it's kind of given me a better perspective on how my mom has gone through life and given me a little bit more peace around that in our relationship.
Right. So this has been such an interesting conversation. We are already out of time. So what I'd like to ask all of you to do, and I'll kick us off, is to actually say your name and the title of your book, and then say one sentence about how you chose your title. So I'll start. Thank you all for being here. My name is Hillary Chute again, and my most recent book is called Why Comics? ? And I actually stole that from the book MetaMouse I worked on with Art Spiegelman, where we decided to have a chapter of that book that was called Why Comics. So that's the story of my title. And Lisa, can we hear from you?
Yeah, so this is my book. Oh yeah, sorry, I was going to say my name. Yeah, I'm Lisa Wool-rim Sjoblom, and my book is called Palimpsest. And I chose this title because Palimpsest refers to a text that has been overwritten by a different text, basically. And I thought that was a perfect metaphor for what adoption is, which is giving us a new life and erasing the old one. But also, if you read the book, you will learn about how our background documents, a lot of us adoptees have had our background documents erased completely. And we have been turned into orphans, even though we have real parents. And then it's been replaced by new documents, giving a full story about who we are to make us adoptable.
Right.
So I thought this somewhat maybe difficult title, and maybe even a bit pretentious, but I really, really love that word. I thought it was perfect for this book.
Thank you. Leslie?
My name is Leslie Stein, and my book's called I Know You're Writer, which is not a Grateful Dead song. It's an old blues song from the 30s, but a lot of people have covered it. And the lyrics to me are about freedom and moving forward and making choices that make you happy.
Great, thank you. Teresa?
Sure. I'm Teresa Wong. My book is Dear Scarlet, the story of my postpartum depression. And I called it Dear Scarlet because it's actually written as a letter to my daughter. And so that's the way you start a letter.
Thank you, everybody. I'll give a round of applause for the panelists. This was a great conversation, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.